They told her to sign the papers quietly. Not in a lawyer's office, not in a courtroom, but in the living room of the Ashby's family estate on a Tuesday morning in October, while the fireplace crackled behind a man who had already made up his mind before she walked through the door. Maren Ashby, 38-year-old wife of Clifton. No, she corrected herself later, former wife, stood in that room and did not cry. She had already cried. She had cried 3 weeks before, alone in the guest bathroom on the second floor, sitting on the cold tile floor with her back against the cabinet under the sink, because that was the only room in the house with a lock that Clifton's mother hadn't had a key copied for. She cried there. She would not cry here. The living room smelled like fresh flowers and something artificial. A candle, maybe. Something that was supposed to suggest warmth but didn't. Clifton sat in the high-backed chair near the window. The one his mother, Nadine Ashby, 67-year-old widow and self-appointed guardian of the Ashby family legacy, had always referred to as the head chair, because everything in this house had a rank, and everyone in it had a place, and Maren's place, according to Nadine, had always been slightly below where she sat. Beside Clifton, close enough that the distance between them wasn't accidental, stood Risa Vance, 31 years old. Her father was Clifton's former college roommate. Nadine had introduced them at a fundraiser 8 months ago and had called it a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. The papers were on the coffee table. Maren looked at them. "We thought this would be easier," Nadine said from the far chair, where she sat with her hands folded in her lap like a woman attending a board meeting rather than the dissolution of her daughter-in-law's marriage. "For everyone." Maren said nothing. She picked up the papers and looked at the first page. Clifton said, "I think it's fair." He was 42 years old. He had the kind of face that photographed well and aged poorly. Not in looks, in character. Lines around the mouth that came not from laughing but from years of making excuses with a pleasant expression. He had told her he loved her at least 400 times in their 8 years of marriage, and she believed that somewhere in those 400 instances, at least a few had been true. The settlement reflects. The attorney, a man whose name Maren had already forgotten, began. "I'll have my attorney review it," Maren said. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when someone says the thing no one expected them to say. Nadine's chin lifted. "We thought you might want to keep this simple." "I do," Maren said. "Simple is my attorney reading whatever this is and explaining it to me. That's very simple." She set the papers back on the coffee table. Not dropped, set. She looked at Clifton for a moment, and then she looked away, because he wasn't worth the full weight of her attention, and she had known that for longer than she had admitted to herself. She picked up her coat from the arm of the sofa and walked out. What Nadine Ashby did not know, what Clifton Ashby did not know, what Risa Vance certainly did not know, was what was sitting in a trust account that Maren's grandmother had established for her. When Maren was 23 years old, the year her grandmother, Eula Pendergast, sold the farmland that had been in the family since the 1940s. Eula had come from people who didn't believe in banks or husbands, not equally, but with similar wariness about both. She had put the money in a structure that Maren didn't fully understand at T3, and then she had sat down with Maren at her kitchen table in Knoxville and explained it anyway. "This is yours," Eula had said. "Not yours and somebody's. Not yours once you figure out what to do with it. Yours. Right now. Do you understand?" Maren had nodded, the way 23-year-olds nod when an older woman is telling them something they won't fully hear until later. "The reason I'm doing it like this," Eula continued, setting her coffee mug down on the plastic tablecloth printed with blue flowers, "is so that when somebody comes along and tries to tell you what you have and don't have, you have papers that say different." Maren had met Clifton 2 years later. She had not told him the full extent of what she had, not because she was hiding it, she hadn't thought of it that way, but because she was 25 years old and in love, and it hadn't come up, and then it continued to not come up, and then they were married, and she was building the trust's portfolio quietly, the way her grandmother had taught her, through a holding company she'd incorporated in Delaware under the name Pendergast Holdings LLC. And by the time Clifton's family business, the Ashby Group, started showing signs of real trouble 3 years into their marriage, the holding company had assets that dwarfed what the Ashby Group was worth in its best year. She hadn't done any of it to plan for what would happen in October. She had just done what her grandmother told her to do. The Ashby Group was a regional development company. Clifton's father, Warren Ashby, had built it from a single commercial property in Atlanta in 1978. By the time Warren died and Clifton inherited the chairman title, it had 17 properties across 4 states and a reputation that was worth almost as much as the real estate itself. Almost. Clifton was not his father. This was something Nadine knew and refused to say out loud, which made it worse, because the silence around that truth became the architecture of every decision the family made afterward. Instead of acknowledging that Clifton was a man who was good at relationships and bad at numbers, they built systems around him. They hired people to compensate. They let the reputation do the work, and for a while, it did. Then the interest rates climbed. 2 of the commercial properties in Charlotte underperformed. A mixed-use development in Nashville ran $4 million over budget, and Clifton had signed off on a contractor that a basic background check would have flagged. Nadine restructured the board twice in 18 months. None of it helped. Maren had seen the financials. Not because Clifton showed her, he wouldn't have, but because Clifton's administrative assistant, a woman named Doris, who had worked for Warren Ashby for 11 years, before Clifton took over and had watched the company decline with the quiet grief of someone who knew exactly why, had taken it upon herself to leave a printed copy of the Q3 summary on the kitchen counter during a dinner party, where Maren happened to be the last person standing in the kitchen after everyone else had moved to the living room. Maren had read it. "How serious is it?" she had asked Clifton later, in bed in the dark, in the way she used to ask him things when the dark made honesty slightly more possible. "We're fine," he had said. She had not pressed. She had instead called her financial advisor the next morning and said, "I want to understand the Ashby Group's debt structure. Public filing only. What can you find?" What he found was not catastrophic, but it was not fine. By the time October arrived, the Ashby Group had received 2 acquisition offers. Clifton rejected both. His mother agreed with the rejections, which was the primary basis on which any decision in that family got made. The logic was that accepting an acquisition would mean admitting the company couldn't stand on its own. The Ashby name could not be bought. The Ashby name would not be subordinate to some outside entity that didn't understand what Warren had built. This was a feeling. It was not a financial strategy. The 3rd offer came in November, 6 weeks after Maren had walked out of the living room with her coat and her composure and nothing else she intended to leave behind. The offer came from a company called Meridian Bridge Capital. The terms were reasonable. More than reasonable. The offer price was above fair market value, which told anyone who looked closely that whoever was behind Meridian Bridge Capital understood the underlying asset value better than the current management did, and was willing to pay for it. Clifton's attorney reviewed the offer. The offer was clean. No unusual conditions. No clauses that flagged on standard review. The holding company behind Meridian Bridge Capital was incorporated correctly, listed an address in Delaware, and had been operating for 11 years. Clifton accepted the offer. The paperwork was signed in February. The first board meeting under new management was held on a Thursday in March. It was scheduled for the Ashby Group's main conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta that still had Warren Ashby's name on a plaque in the lobby. Clifton arrived 12 minutes early, which was unusual for him. Nadine was not supposed to be there. She had resigned from the board as part of the transition, but she was there anyway, standing near the credenza with a cup of coffee, because she had never quite accepted the idea that rooms she'd spent years in could belong to other people. Risa Vance was not there. She did not work for the company. She had no reason to be there, but she had come anyway, riding up with Clifton in the elevator, standing beside him the way she had stood beside him at the estate in October, close enough to signal something, not close enough to be asked to leave. The new managing partner arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. Her name was Maren, not introduced yet. Just in the doorway with a leather portfolio in her hand and a woman beside her, Cecile, 44, general counsel for Pendergast Holdings, and 3 members of the incoming board, 2 of whom had flown in from Chicago the night before and were still carrying the slightly flattened look of people who had slept in airport hotels. Clifton saw her and did not move. Risa saw her and took 1 step backward, which she would not have done if she were more practiced at hiding her feelings. But she was 21 years old in her emotional responses, even if the calendar said 31. Nadine put down her coffee cup. "What is this?" Nadine said. Not to Maren. She addressed the question to the room, the way people do when they want to express displeasure without technically engaging with the person causing it. Maren crossed to the head of the table, the chair at the top, the one that in this room had always been the one Warren sat in, and then Clifton, and then the rotating cast of interim executives who had tried to stabilize what Clifton had let drift. And she set her portfolio down. Cecile beside her opened her briefcase. The transition documents were transmitted to counsel on February 18th. Cecile said, in the even tone of a woman who had delivered unwelcome clarity many times before and had learned that the less emotion she put into it, the more room there was for the information to land. Meridian Bridge Capital completed acquisition of the Ashby Group in full. Managing ownership interest was transferred to Pendergast Holdings LLC on the same date. Miss Pendergast Ashby holds controlling authority effective immediately, Pendergast, Nadine said. She said it the way someone says a word when the sound of it is making them reassemble something in their mind. By what right? Clifton said. And he stopped. He looked at Marin. He looked at the portfolio on the table. He looked at Cecile. He looked back at Marin. By what right are you here? Marin did not answer immediately. She pulled back the chair at the head of the table and sat down. She opened her portfolio. She looked up at him. Ownership, she said. The story, as it turned out, was longer than anyone in that conference room had the patience for. But Marin had done something she had always done well, which was to prepare for a moment before it arrived so thoroughly that the moment itself required almost nothing of her. Eula Pendergast had died 5 years ago, in the spring, on a Tuesday morning not unlike the Tuesday morning in October, when Marin had stood in the living room of the Ashby estate and set those papers back on the coffee table. Eula had died in her own house, in her own bed, which was what she had wanted, and she had left behind a woman she had shaped with the specific intention of making someone who could not be easily undone. Marin had used the trust not recklessly but patiently. The holding company had grown through the years of her marriage, not because she was planning a divorce, but because she was following the principle her grandmother had written out on an index card that Marin still kept in the left inside pocket of her leather portfolio. Don't wait to be given access. Build your own door. When the Ashby Group's financial situation became clear, not from any insider information, just from public filings and basic observation, Marin's advisor had brought it to her as a possibility, not an inevitability, a question. The underlying properties are undervalued in the current model, he had said. If the company were managed differently, the asset value comes back. Is that a recommendation? She had asked. It's an observation. She had sat with that observation for 3 weeks. Then she had called Cecile and said, I need to structure something carefully. It was careful. It was structured through Meridian Bridge Capital, which was a legitimate entity that Pendergast Holdings had used before for exactly this kind of indirect acquisition. There was nothing illegal about it. There was nothing that required disclosure to Clifton because they were separated by then, and the holding company predated the marriage by 2 years, and her attorney had reviewed every step. None of it was about revenge. That was the part people would always get wrong when they heard this story. Marin had not bought the Ashby Group to humiliate Clifton. She had bought it because the underlying assets were good and the management was bad, and she had the capital and the patience to fix it. The fact that Clifton had signed the sale without knowing who was on the other side was not her design. She had not hidden it from him. She had simply not told him, which was different, and which had the additional distinction of being something he himself had been doing to her for years. Clifton did not take it quietly. That was his prerogative, and it was something Marin had anticipated. He called the attorneys. He called the attorneys his mother called. He called someone his father used to use, who had been practicing since the 1980s, and who was brought in specifically because his presence was supposed to signal seriousness. They looked at the acquisition documents. They looked at the Delaware incorporation records. They looked at the trust structure. They called back within a week. The structure was sound. The trust predated the marriage. Pendergast Holdings was not a marital asset. The acquisition had been conducted at arm's length. There was no fraud. There was no misrepresentation. There was no legal mechanism available that would unwind what had been done. Clifton's attorney said this to him on the phone. Marin heard it secondhand from Cecile, who had it from opposing counsel, which was the kind of information that travels through legal channels in both directions when both sides have good attorneys and the case is going nowhere. Nadine reportedly did not speak for 2 days. Risa reportedly was in the picture for approximately 6 more weeks, at which point the picture changed. The Ashby Group under new management filed its first restructured financial report in May. 2 of the underperforming properties in Charlotte were renegotiated. The Nashville development, the one that had run over budget under a contractor who never should have been hired, was completed under a new firm and sold within 90 days at a margin that covered the overrun and returned a profit. The name on the board in the lobby remained. Warren Ashby had built real things, and the things he built deserved to be managed properly. Marin was not interested in erasing him. She was interested in running the company the way it should have been run by the person who inherited it, but wasn't. She hired Doris as her executive assistant. Doris had retired 6 months into Clifton's tenure, had gone back to work at a title company across town, and had spent 3 years watching the Ashby Group decline with the specific helpless feeling of someone who sees a thing going wrong and has no authority to stop it. When Marin called her, she said she'd call back. She called back in 4 minutes. The divorce was finalized in April. before the board meeting in March had time to become fully public knowledge, which meant the settlement had been negotiated without either side knowing what March would look like. Marin's attorney had negotiated it carefully, taking what was fair and leaving behind what was not. The Ashby estate, the house, the furniture, the fireplace, the high-backed chair at the head of the living room stayed with the family. Marin had never wanted it. She had a house she bought in her own name before the marriage, a 2-story in Decatur that she had rented out for 8 years, and she moved back into it with 2 carloads of things and the specific feeling of a woman returning to a room she should never have left. The night she moved back in, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't finish and thought about her grandmother's kitchen table. The blue flower tablecloth, the way Eula had set down her coffee mug, and looked at her with the expression of a woman transmitting something urgent across a generational distance. This is yours. Marin had not fully understood it at 23. She understood it now. People who heard the story later, and people did hear it, because Atlanta was not a small city, but the overlap between its business community and its social community was specific enough that things traveled, tended to focus on the part where Marin walked into the conference room and sat at the head of the table. They made that the story, the confrontation, the single word, the look on Clifton's face. They turned it into a moment of drama, which it was, but which was also the least important thing that had happened. The most important thing was the index card. The most important thing was a woman in a kitchen in Knoxville, a Tuesday morning years earlier, putting down her coffee cup and looking at a 23-year-old girl and saying, "Someone is going to try to tell you what you have and don't have. Make sure you have papers that say different." The second most important thing was that Marin had listened, not just heard, listened, and then had done the quiet, unglamorous, years-long work of making it real. Not because she knew she'd need it. Not because she was planning for a day in October when a man she had loved would hand her papers in front of his mother and a woman he'd chosen over her. But because her grandmother had told her to, and her grandmother had never been wrong about the things that mattered. The conference room, the chair, the single word, that was just the day the work became visible. The work had been happening all along. What Nadine Ashby could not accept, even later, was not that the company had been sold. She could have accepted that in time. What she could not accept was the particular shape of it. That the woman she had spent 8 years treating as temporary had turned out to be the most permanent thing in the room. That the person she had considered beneath the Ashby name had understood the value of what the Ashby name was built on better than the people who carried it. Warren Ashby had built something real. It deserved someone who would treat it as real. That was the tragedy. A board member said quietly to Cecile over lunch after the May report came out that it took this long for the right person to be in charge. The right person had been enough a family time. They just hadn't paid enough attention to know it.